Matt Kean, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
The federal government has said if the private sector does not build a gas-fired power station in the Hunter by the end of this month, they will build it. Is that going to happen?
Well, the federal government shares the same concerns that I do here in New South Wales, and that is that we're going to have the early exit of dispatchable capacity before it's replaced. We need to make sure that before Vales Point closes, Araring and Bayswater close, which is over the next 15 years, that we've replaced that capacity in the system. We need to avoid the instability in the grid that early closure would bring and the price spikes. And that's exactly why we've got a roadmap here in New South Wales.
Hang on, so do you support the federal government getting involved in building a gas-fired power station?
We support the delivery of dispatchable capacity into the market before the closure of existing infrastructure. So that could look like gas, that could look like pumped hydro, that could look like batteries. There are a range of technologies that will ensure we get reliable electricity, dispatchable electricity that's also cheap.
So is that a yes, or is that could be one option? Because it sounds like you're saying that could be one option, but...
It's certainly an option, but there are a suite of measures that we're putting in place to ensure that we keep the lights on and drive prices down in New South Wales. So we welcome the federal government's commitment to build capacity into New South Wales, but we're not just relying on the federal government. We've got our own strategy to ensure that we keep the lights on, drive prices down, and deliver us some of the lowest electricity prices in the world.
Well, Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor, they've said 1,000 megawatts is required in capacity once Liddell shuts. Is that right?
Well, Liddell has a nameplate capacity of about 1,400 megawatts. Right now, it only runs at about 700 megawatts. So we think that 1,000 megawatts is a lot of additional capacity. We're not saying that we would knock it back, but we're saying that there are other measures that we're putting in place to replace it that are in the interests of consumers. Ultimately, this infrastructure has got to be paid for by consumers, and we want to make sure their bills are as long as possible and that we make sure the grid remains reliable.
All right, so if you build the 1,000 megawatt gas-fired power stations, do consumers could they end up paying more?
Well, absolutely. The last thing we want to see is the gold plating of our electricity network. That said, we don't want to do anything that will risk the stability of the grid. People need to be able to flick the switch and the lights need to work. And that requires having dispatchable capacity in the system before existing infrastructure closes. Now, in the next 15 years, 4 of our existing coal-fired power stations in New South Wales will come to the end of their lives. They'll just turn off. It's got nothing to do with climate change. It's got everything to do with the fact they're old pieces of machinery. We need to replace those generators before they close. Otherwise, we'll see what's happened in Victoria in the past when Hazelwood closed, unscheduled, massive price spikes and blackouts. That's not acceptable for anyone.
Well, we've seen this closure of your lawn in Victoria, or announced closure 5 years early, 2028, this week. Obviously, a lot of people are saying, Kerry Schott, for example, from the Energy Security Board, believes coal-fired power stations will close early here. What will that mean?
Well, if coal-fired power stations close before they're replaced, that means high prices and a less reliable grid. That's not acceptable. That's not acceptable for families across New South Wales, and it's certainly not acceptable for our manufacturing industry. That's why we've put in place a policy that will see existing coal-fired power stations replaced before they close.
Well, but there is an argument that your renewable energy push and promise to underwrite those projects would be one of the forces that lead coal-fired power stations to close earlier. What would you say to that?
There are a range of factors that will determine early closure of coal. That will include whether or not the owners of those assets will invest in the maintenance and capital upgrades required to keep them open, whether or not the wholesale price remains high. It's in the interest of existing generators to keep prices high because they make more money. That's not in consumers' interest. So we need to get the balance right, but my focus is on making sure that we keep prices as low as possible, we keep the lights on, and we set our manufacturing industry up for success in the future. We know the world is moving to a lower carbon economy. 50% of the world's GDP is now generated in jurisdictions that have committed to net zero emissions. So we need to support Australian manufacturing and enable them to be able to compete in that world. And that means giving them access to cheap, clean but reliable energy, and that's what our plan does.
What about nuclear? Do you think we'll ever have nuclear power stations in Australia?
Yeah, I think so. There's some exciting things happening on the nuclear front. So a company in the United States is developing technology around small modular nuclear reactors. So that's effectively a nuclear power plant in something the size of a shipping container. Now, right now, the prototype of that is being developed, but we're not expecting that to be commercially available until the mid-2030s. So we're excited about the opportunities that technological innovation will bring. But right now, at this stage, the best way to reduce or to transition or replace our coal-fired power stations is with the technology that we know works and that we have available. And that's a combination of wind, solar, batteries, gas and pumped hydro, and that's exactly what our roadmap's about. So into the future, will nuclear have a role to play? I think so, and I hope so, but right now I can't bet on technology that isn't readily available.
And the bigger reactors are just too politically controversial, aren't they?
I don't even think that's the case. I think the issue with the bigger reactors is that they're not economically viable. Right now, the UK government is building a new nuclear reactor, large-scale nuclear reactor. They're underwriting the build of that plant to the tune of $180 per megawatt hour. That's almost 3 times what we're currently paying for our electricity prices. So aside from the political risks, you've got a huge economic impact on New South Wales consumers, and not to mention that plant that the UK is building started construction in 2008 and it won't be ready until around 2025. We don't have that long to wait.
Scott Morrison at this point is not committing to a target net zero emissions by 2050, should he?
Well, that's a matter for the federal government.
I'm asking you, should he?
That's a matter for Scott Morrison. We've got a target here in New South Wales. In fact, we were one of the first jurisdictions anywhere in the world to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. We've got a 35% emissions reduction by 2030. And the reason we've done that is not just because we care about our environment, but we care about our economy. We think it makes sense for Australian manufacturers and Australian businesses. The rest of the world is decarbonising, whether you like it or not. And
does it make sense for Scott Morrison to do it then?
Well, I don't have a perspective. I don't have all the information available to me as to the impacts that will have on other states and territories. But we've taken this decision in New South Wales because it's in our best interest.
What about the old argument John Howard and Scott Morrison have used around a target that Australia's annual emissions are produced by China in 9 days? If China and India don't come on board, what's the point of little Australia doing something on this front?
Well, the reality is that countries like the United States, countries like China, countries like Japan and South Korea have committed to achieve net zero emissions by the middle of this century. So they are moving in this direction. Well, China's committed to hit net zero emissions by 2060. Now, if we want to continue to export into those markets, then we face real risks if we don't get with the program and start to decarbonise. You've already seen moves to put carbon tariffs in place in places like Europe and the UK. They're important markets for Australia, and I want to make sure Australian manufacturing is able to continue to export into those markets. Andrew, we're a small open market economy, so if the rest of the world is moving, if the global economies are changing the type of products that they demand, then we should be positioning ourselves to continue to supply them, not put our head in the sand and ignore these realities.
There's a cynical view about you that you've taken on this issue with such gusto because it's something you can stand for and become New South Wales Premier or even have a federal career. What would you say to that?
What I'd say is that I'm acting in the interests of New South Wales. I'm acting in the interests of Australia. This is not about being left or right. This is not about ideological issues or cultural wars. This is about those of us that want to embrace the future versus those of us that want to return to the past. I mean, those people defending the status quo are effectively defending Blockbuster in what is a Netflix world. So I think the Liberal Party, the party of free markets, the party that's always looked to build a stronger and more prosperous Australia, should be looking to the future, embracing these opportunities and setting ourselves up for success.
Would you rule out running for Warringah at the next federal election?
I'm absolutely focused on being the New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment from now into the election. And, you know, if those plans change, it would be because the Premier decides that she's got other things in mind for me.
So you'd never have a federal tilt next time?
Well, I'm not going to engage in your hypotheticals. I'm interested in making sure that I can use my skills to make the biggest difference for our state and indeed our country. And right now that's as the New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment.
Now, you've known Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull through the New South Wales Division of the Liberal Party. And there was a story with a phone call from Turnbull to you, I remember actually writing, where he said Scott just wants to keep his arse in C1 about the timing of a federal election. With this Christian Porter stuff that's come up recently, there's been a lot of Malcolm Turnbull out and about talking about the issue. Do you think Malcolm Turnbull's got it in for Scott Morrison?
Not at all. I think Malcolm Turnbull, like Scott Morrison, believe that the Liberal Party is the party to best look after the interests of our nation and best prepare our nation for these huge changes which are happening on the global stage. Scott Morrison is an outstanding leader, and I've got every confidence that under his leadership our country can go from strength to strength.
Operation Keppel's still going into Darryl Maguire. It's been extended. Do you think your boss, Gladys Berejiklian, has anything to worry about in relation to that?
Not at all. Gladys Berejiklian is the best leader in the country. She's led us through the pandemic in a way that would be the envy of the world. She is someone that's beyond reproach, and I've got every confidence that she'll not only be cleared through that process, but the public will support her going forward as they currently are.
Matt Kean, thanks for your time.
Great to be with you, Andrew.